Good evening, friends, fiends, and spooky night owl supremes. Welcome to A Bit Light, where I am bundled up in 2 blankets tonight to read tonight's tale because it is chilly here, and that's got nothing to do with the fact that our ghost story is finally heating up. Sorry. As we continue our dive into The Turn of the Screw, or one of the stories behind Bly Manor, wrap yourself up in some blankets, wrap your hands around a mug of hot cocoa or tea, light a candle, and summon your animal familiars. Before we head off into part 4 of our story, last we read in chapters 6 through 8, we learned so much more about the dead dread specter, Peter Quint. The governess also had an encounter with a new specter, Miss Jessel, while playing with little Flora at the pond. She has the startling revelation that both Miles and Flora, despite their attempts to feign ignorance, actually perfectly remember their dealings with both Peter Quint and the deceased Miss Jessel. She had kind of been hoping they had magically had their memories wiped of them, I guess. And now the governess realizes that the 2 children are trying to protect her from the ghostly beings just as she thought she was protecting them. Oh well. Mrs. Gross is finally more forthcoming with information. It took long enough. Could have saved the governess a lot of heartache and suffering, but yeah, that catches us up to speed for tonight's foray into Bly Manor, The Turn of the Screw, part 4, which is chapters 9, 10, and 11, if you're following along. The Turn of the Screw, chapter 9. I waited and waited, and the days as they elapsed took something from my consternation. A very few of them, in fact, passing in constant sight of my pupils without a fresh incident sufficed to give to grievous fancies and even to odious memories a kind of brush of the sponge. So she's forgetting how bad things were. I have spoken of the surrender to their extraordinary childish grace as a thing I could actively cultivate, and it may be imagined if I neglected now to address myself to this source for whatever it would yield. Stranger than I can express certainly was the effort to struggle against my new lights. It would have doubtless have been, however, a greater tension still had it not been so frequently successful. I used to wonder how my little charges could help guessing that I thought strange things about them, and the circumstances that these things only made them more interesting was not by itself a direct aid to keeping them in the dark. I trembled lest they should see that they were so immensely more interesting. Putting things at the worst, at all events, as in meditation I so often did, any clouding of their innocence could only be, blameless and foredoomed as they were, a reason the more for taking risks. There were moments when, by an irresistible impulse, I found myself catching them up and pressing them to my heart. As soon as I had done so, I used to say to myself, "What will they think of me? Does it betray me too much?" I mean, they probably need love and attention. They've been alone for so long. It would have been so easy to get into a sad, wild tangle about how much I might betray, but the real account, I feel, of the hours of peace that I could still enjoy was that in the immediate charm of my companions was a beguilement still effective under the shadow of the possibility that it was studied. For it occurred to me that I might occasionally excite suspicion by the little outbreaks of my sharper passion for them. So too, I remember wondering if I mightn't see an oddness in the traceable increase of their own demonstrations. They were at this period extravagantly and preternaturally fond of me, which, after all, I could reflect was no more than a graceful response in children perpetually bowed over and hugged. The homage of which they were so lavishly succeeded, in truth, for my nerves quite as well as if I had never appeared to myself, as I may say, literally to catch them at a purpose in it. They had never, I think, wanted to do so many things for their poor protectress. I mean, though they got their lessons better and better, which was naturally what would please her most, in the way of diverting, entertaining, and surprising her, reading her passages, telling her stories, acting her charades, pouncing at her in disguises as animals and historic characters, and, above all, astonishing her by the pieces they had secretly got by heart and could interminably recite. Ooh, now that is in the show when they recite and put on little plays for everybody in the house. Pretty cool, really creepy though. Really creepy. I mean, yes, I would put on plays as a kid, but it just was creepy in the show, and probably in the book. But it was endearing to the governess. And she refers to herself in the third person for a few parts of this, which is confusing. But anyway, we continue on. I should never get to the bottom, were I to let myself go even now, of the prodigious private commentary, all under still more private correction in which in these days I overscored their full hours. They had shown me from the first a facility for everything, a general faculty which, taking a fresh start, achieved remarkable flights. They got their little tasks as if they loved them and indulged from the mere exuberance of the gift in the most unimposed little miracles of memory. They not only popped out at me as tigers and as Romans, but as Shakespeareans, astronomers, and navigators. This was so singularly the case that it had presumably much to do with the fact as to which, at the present day, I am at a loss for a different explanation. I allude to my unnatural composure on the subject of another school for miles. What I remember is that I was content not, for the time, to open the question, and that the contentment must have sprung from the sense of his perpetually striking show of cleverness. He was too clever for a bad governess, for a parson's daughter to spoil, and the strangest if not the brightest thread in the pensive embroidery I just spoke of was the impression I might have got, if I had dared to work it out, was that he was under some influence operating in his intellectual life as a tremendous incitement. If it was easy to reflect, however, that such a boy could postpone school, it was at least as marked that for such a boy to have been kicked out by a schoolmaster was a mystification without end. They never did tell us how and why he got kicked out. The great mystery. Let me add that in their company now, and I was careful almost never to be out of it, I could follow no scent very far. We lived in a cloud of music and love and success in private theatricals. The musical sense in each of the children was of the quickest, but the elder in especial had a marvelous knack of catching and repeating. The schoolroom piano broke into all gruesome fancies, and when that failed, there were confabulations in corners, with the sequel of one of them going out into the highest spirits in order to come in as something new. I had had brothers myself, and it was no revelation to me that little girls could be slavish idolaters of little boys. Okay, sure. What surpassed everything there was that a little boy in the world who could have for his little sister so fine a consideration in return. It's not really that surprising. Siblings do love each other. They were extraordinarily at one. Not creepy at all. And to say that they never either quarreled or complained is to make the note of praise coarse for their quality of sweetness. Sometimes indeed, when I dropped into coarseness, I perhaps came across the traces of little understandings between them by which one of them should keep me occupied while the other slipped away. There is a naive side, I suppose, in all diplomacy, but if my pupils practiced upon me, it was surely with the minimum of grossness. It was all in the other quarter that, after a lull, the grossness broke out. I find that I really hang back, but I must take my plunge. It's about time. Seriously. In going on with the record of what was hideous at Bly, I not only challenged the most liberal faith, for which I little care, but, and this is another matter, I renew what I myself suffered. I again pushed my way through it to the end. This was not going to be easy. There came suddenly an hour after which, as I look back, the affair seemed to me to have been all pure suffering. But I have at least reached the heart of it, and the straightest road out is doubtless to advance. Quickest way out is through. Right. One evening, with nothing to lead up to or prepare it, I felt the cold touch of the impression that had breathed on me the night of my arrival, and which, much lighter then, as I have mentioned, I should probably have made a little of in memory had my subsequent sojourn been less agitated. I had not gone to bed. I sat reading by a couple of candles. There was a room full of old books at Bly, last-century fiction, some of it which, to the extent of a distinctly deprecated renown, but never to so much as that of a stray specimen, had reached the sequestered home and appealed to the unavowed curiosity of my youth. I remember that the book I had in my hand was Fielding's Amelia, also that I was wholly awake. I recall further both the general conviction that it was horribly late and a particular objection to looking at my watch. I figure finally that the white curtain draping in the fashion of those days, the head of little Flora's bed, shrouded, as I had assured myself long before, the perfection of the childish rest. I recollect in short that, though I was deeply interested in my author, I found myself at the turn of a page and with his spell all scattered, looking straight up from him and hard at the door of my room. There was a moment during which I listened, reminded of the faint sense I had had the first night of there being something undefinably astir in the house, and noted the soft breath of the open casement just move in the half-drawn blind. Then, with all the marks of a deliberation that must have seemed magnificent had there been anyone to admire it, I laid down my book, rose to my feet, and, taking a candle, went straight out of the room and, from the passage on which my light made little impression, noiselessly closed and locked the door. I can now say neither what determined nor what guided me, but I went straight along the lobby, holding my candle high till I came within sight of the tall window that presided over the great turn of the staircase. At this point, I precipitately found myself aware of three things. They were practically simultaneous, yet they had flashes of succession. My candle, under a bold flourish, went out, and I perceived by the uncovered window that the yielding dusk of earliest morning rendered it unnecessary. Without it, in the next instant, I saw that there was someone on the stair. I speak of sequences, but I required no lapse of seconds to stiffen myself for a third encounter with Quint. The apparition had reached the landing halfway up and was, therefore, on the spot nearest the window, where at sight of me it stopped short and fixed me exactly as it had fixed me from the tower and from the garden. He knew me well as I knew him, and so in the cold, faint twilight, with a glimmer in the high glass and another on the polish of the oak stair below, we faced each other in our common intensity. He was absolutely, on this occasion, a living, detestable, dangerous presence. But that was not the wonder of wonders. I reserved this distinction for quite another circumstance. The circumstance that dread had unmistakably quitted me and that there was nothing in me that didn't meet and measure him. I had plenty of anguish after that extraordinary moment, but I had, thank God, no terror. And he knew I had not. I found myself at the end of an instant magnificently aware of this. I felt in a fierce rigor of confidence that if I stood my ground a minute I should cease, for the time at least, to have him to reckon with. And during this minute accordingly, the thing was as human and hideous as a real interview. Hideous just because it was human. As human to have met alone in the small hours, in a sleeping house, some enemy, some adventurer, some criminal. It was the dead silence of our long gaze at such close quarters that gave the whole horror, huge as it was, its only note of the unnatural. If I had met a murderer in such a place at such an hour, we still at least would have spoken. Something would have passed in life between us. If nothing had passed, one of us would have moved. The moment was so prolonged that it would have taken but a little more to make me doubt if even I were in life. I can't express what followed it save by saying that the silence itself, which was indeed in a manner an attestation of my strength, became the element into which I saw the figure disappear, in which I definitely saw it turn as I might have seen the low wretch to which it had once belonged turn on the receipts of an order and pass, with my eyes on the villainous back that no hunch could have more disfigured, straight down the staircase and into the darkness in which the next bend was lost. Ooh, spooky. She's had a ghostly encounter on the stairs with what feels like a real person, though. Cool. We're getting some ghosty stuff now. Finally! It's no longer just, well, we think, well, maybe. No, it's here. It is here, and we are here for it, right? The Turn of the Screw, Chapter 10. I remained a while at the top of the stair, but with the effect presently of understanding that when my visitor had gone, he had gone. Then I returned to my room. The foremost thing I saw there by the light of the candle I had left burning was that Flora's little bed was empty, and on this I caught my breath with all the terror that, 5 minutes before, I had been able to resist. I dashed at the place in which I had left her lying and over which, for the small silk counterpane and the sheets were disarranged, the white curtains had been deceivingly pulled forward. Then my step, to my unutterable relief, produced an answering sound. I perceived an agitation of the window blind, and the child, ducking down, emerged rosily from the other side of it. She stood there in so much of her candor and so little of her nightgown, with her pink bare feet and her golden glow of her curls. She looked intensely grave, and I had never had such a sense of losing an advantage acquired, the thrill of which had just been so prodigious, as on my conscience that she addressed me with a reproach. "You naughty, where have you been?" Instead of challenging her own irregularity, I found myself arraigning and explaining. She herself explained, for that matter, with the loveliest eager simplicity. She had known suddenly as she lay there that I was out of the room, and had jumped to see what had become of me. I had dropped, with the joy of her reappearance, back into my chair, feeling then and only then a little faint, and she pattered straight over to me, thrown herself upon my knee, given herself to be held with the flame of the candle full in the wonderful little face that was still flushed with sleep. I remember closing my eyes an instant, yieldingly, consciously as before, the excess of something beautiful that shone out of the blue of her own. "You were looking for me out of the window," I said. "You thought I might be walking in the grounds?" "Well, you know, I thought someone was." She never blanched, and she smiled out that at me. Oh, how I looked at her now. "And did you see anyone?" No," she returns, almost with the full privilege of childish inconsequence, resentfully, though with a long sweetness in her drawl of the negative. At that moment, in the state of my nerves, I absolutely believed that she lied. And if I once more closed my eyes, it was before the dazzle of the 3 or 4 possible ways in which I might take this up. Can't lie to the governess now, she's on to you. One of these, for a moment, tempted me with such a singular intensity that, to withstand it, I must have gripped my little girl with a spasm that, wonderfully, she submitted to without a cry or a sign of fright. Why not break out at her on the spot and have it all over? Give it to her straight in her lovely little lighted face. You see, you know that you do, and that you already quite suspect I believe it. Therefore, why not frankly confess it to me so that we may at least live with it together and learn perhaps in the strangeness of our fate where we are at and what it means? That's how you talk to a really small child? That's really verbose. I feel like Henry James's child has the mind of a adult. They're comprehending these words and sentence structures. Which cool. Anyway, she says out with it to the girl. Then, the solicitation dropped alas as it came. If I could immediately have succumbed to it, I might have spared myself. Well, you'll see what. Instead of succumbing, I sprang again to my feet, looked at her bed, and took a helpless middle way. Why did you pull the curtain over the place to make me think you were still there? Flora luminously considered, after which, with her little divine smile, "Because I don't like to frighten you." "But if I had, by your idea, gone out?" She absolutely declined to be puzzled. She turned her eyes to the flame of the candle as if the question were as irrelevant, or at any rate as impersonal, as Mrs. Marset or 9 times 9. "Oh, but you know," she quite adequately answered, "that you might come back, you dear, and that you have." And after a little, when she had gone into bed, I had for a long time almost sitting on her to hold her hand to prove that I recognized the pertinence of my return. Poor little Flora was scared, and now she has her protectress back, even if she didn't want to show she was scared. You may imagine the general complexion from that moment of my nights. I repeatedly sat up till I didn't know when. I selected moments when my roommate unmistakably slept and, stealing out, took noiseless turns in the passage and even pushed as far as to where I had last met Quint. But I never met him there again, and I may as well say at once that I on no other occasion saw him in the house. I just missed on the staircase, on the other hand, a different adventure. Looking down at it from the top, I once recognized the presence of a woman seated on one of the lower steps, with her back presented to me, her body half bowed and her head in an attitude of woe in her hands. I had been there but an instant, however, when she vanished without looking round at me. That was probably pretty lucky. I knew nonetheless exactly what dreadful face she had to show, and I wondered whether, if instead of being above I had been below, I should have had for going up the same nerve I had shown Quint. Well, there continued to be plenty of chance for nerve. Great, the ghosts continue. On the 11th night after my latest encounter with that gentleman, I'm sure she means air quotes gentleman because Peter Quint is not a gentleman, They were all numbered now. I had an alarm that perilously skirted it, and that indeed, from the particular quality of its unexpectedness, proved quite my sharpest shock. It was precisely the first night during this series that, weary with watching, I had felt that I might again without laxity lay myself down at my old hour. I slept immediately and, as I afterward knew, till about 1 o'clock. But when I woke, it was to sit straight up, as completely roused as if a hand had shook me. I had left a light burning, but it was out now, and I felt an instant certainty that Flora had extinguished it. This brought me to my feet and straight in the darkness to her bed, which I found she had left. A glance at the window enlightened me further, and the striking of a match completed the picture. The child had got up, this time blowing out the taper, and had again, for some purpose of observation or response, squeezed in behind the blind and was peering out into the night. That's not creepy at all. That she now saw, as she had not, as I satisfied myself the previous time, was proved to me by the fact that she was disturbed neither by my re-illumination nor by the haste I made to get into slippers and into a wrap. Hidden, protected, absorbed, she evidently rested on the sill, the casement open forward, and gave herself up. There was the great still moon to help her, and this fact had counted in my quick decision. She was face to face with the apparition we had met at the lake, and could now communicate with it as she had not been able to do then. What I, on my side, had to care for was, without disturbing her, to reach from the corridor, some other window in the same corridor. I got to the door without her hearing me. I got out of it, closed it, and listened from the other side for sound from her. While I stood in the passage, I had my eyes on her brother's door, which was but 10 steps off, and which, indescribably, produced in me a renewal of the strange impulse that I had lately spoke of as my temptation. What if I should go straight in and march to his window? What if, by risking to his boyish bewilderment a revelation of my motive, I should throw across the rest of the mystery the long halter of my boldness? This thought held me sufficiently to make me cross to his threshold and pause again. I preternaturally listened. I figured to myself what might portentously be. I wondered if his bed were also empty and he too were secretly at watch. It was a deep, soundless minute, the end of which my impulse failed. He was quiet. He might be innocent. The risk was hideous. I turned away. There was a figure in the grounds, a figure prowling for a sight, the visitor with whom Flora was engaged, but it was not the visitor most concerned with my boy. I hesitated afresh, but on other grounds and only for a few seconds. Then I had made my choice. There were empty rooms at Bly, and it was only a question of choosing the right one. The right one suddenly presented itself to me as the lower one, though high above the gardens in a solid corner of the house that I have spoken of as the old tower. This was a large square chamber arranged with some state as a bedroom, the extravagant size of which had made it so inconvenient that it had not for years, though kept by Mrs. Gross in exemplary order, been occupied. I had often admired it, and I knew my way about in it. I had only, after just faltering at the first chill gloom of its disuse, to pass across it and unbolt as quietly as I could one of the shutters. Achieving this transit, I uncovered the glass without a sound and, applying my face to the pane, was able, the darkness without being much less than within, to see that I commanded the right direction. Then I saw something more. The moon made the night extraordinarily penetrable and showed me on the lawn a person, diminished by distance, who stood there motionless and as if fascinated, looking up to where I had appeared. Looking, that is, not so much straight at me as at something that was apparently above me. There was clearly another person above me. There was a person on the tower, but the presence on the lawn was not in the least what I had conceived and had confidently hurried to meet. The presence on the lawn, I felt sick as I made it out, was poor little Miles himself. Dun dun dun. Chills and hair raising. The supernatural is here. The Turn of the Screw, Chapter 11. It was not till late the next day that I spoke to Mrs. Gross. the rigor with which I kept my pupils in sight making it often difficult to meet her privately, and the more as we felt the importance of not provoking, on the part of the servants quite as much as on that of the children, any suspicion of a secret flurry or that of a discussion of mysteries. I drew a great security in this particular from her mere smooth aspect. There was nothing in her fresh face to pass on to others my horrible confidences. She believed me, I was sure, absolutely. If she hadn't, I don't know what would become of me, for I couldn't have borne this business alone. But she was a magnificent monument to the blessing of a want of imagination. And if she could see in our little charges nothing but their beauty and amiability, their happiness and cleverness, she had no direct communication with the sources of my trouble. If they had been at all visibly blighted or battered, she would doubtless have grown, on tracing it back, haggard enough to match them, as matters stood. However, I could feel her when she surveyed them, with her large white arms folded and the habit of serenity in all her look. Thank the Lord's mercy that if they were ruined, the pieces would still serve. Flights of fancy gave place in her mind to a steady fireside glow, and I had already begun to perceive how, with the development of the conviction that, as time went on without a public accident, our young things could, after all, look out for themselves, she addressed her greatest solicitude to the sad case presented by their instructress. That, for myself, was a sound simplification. I could engage that to the world my face should tell no tales, but it would have been in the conditions an immense added strain to find myself anxious about hers. I do love how in the midst of all this terrifying, spooky stuff there is trust and friendship and love and admiration growing between these two, though. That makes it nice. And at the beginning, the person who is reading this to us in the story, that's not me, but the reader in the story, said that she loves someone in the stories, and we would find out who. Woo-hoo. Anyway, at the hour I now speak of, she had joined me under pressure on the terrace where, with the lapse of the season, the afternoon sun was now agreeable, and we sat there together while, before us, at a distance, but within a call if we wished, the children strolled to and fro in one of their most manageable moods. They moved slowly, in unison, 'cause that's not creepy, below us over the lawn. The boy, as they went, reading aloud from a storybook and passing his arm round his sister to keep her quite in touch. Mrs. Gross watched them with a positive placidity. Then I caught the suppressed intellectual creak with which she conscientiously turned to take me from a view of the back of the tapestry. I had made her a receptacle of lurid things, really? But there was an odd recognition of my accomplishments and my function in her presence under my pain. She offered her mind to my disclosures as, had I wished to mix a witch's broth and proposed it with assurance, she would have held out a large, clean saucepan. This had become thoroughly her attitude by the time that, in my recital of the events of the night, I reached the point of which Miles had said to me when, after seeing him at such a monstrous hour, almost on the very spot where he happened now to be, I had gone down to bring him in, choosing then at the window with a concentrated need of not alarming the house. Rather that method than a signal more resonant. I had left her meanwhile in little doubt of my small hope of representing with success even to her actual sympathy my sense of the real splendor of the little inspiration with which, after I had gotten him into the house, the boy met my final articulate challenge. As soon as I appeared in the moonlight on the terrace, he had come to me straight as possible, on which I had taken his hand without a word and led him, through the dark spaces, up the staircase where Quint had so hungrily hovered for him, along the lobby where I had listened and trembled, and so to his forsaken room. Not a sound on the way had passed between us, and I had wondered, oh how I had wondered, if he were groping about in his mind for a little something plausible and not too grotesque. It would tax his invention, certainly, and I felt this time over his real embarrassment a curious thrill of triumph. It was a sharp trap for the inscrutable. He couldn't play any longer at innocence, so how the deuce would he get out of it? There beat in me indeed with the passionate throb of this question an equal dumb appeal as to how the deuce I should. I was confronted at last, and never yet, with all the risk attached even now to the sounding of my own horrid note. I I remember, in fact, that as we pushed into his little chamber where the bed had not been slept in at all and the window uncovered to the moonlight made the place so clear that there was no need of striking a match, I remember how I suddenly dropped, sank upon the edge of the bed from the force of the idea that he must know how he really, as they say, had me. Doesn't really matter who knows what at this point, just get out with it and get to the truth. Why dance around it? He could do what he liked, with all his cleverness to help him, so long as I should continue to defer to the old tradition of the criminality of those caretakers of the young who ministered to superstitions and fears. He had me indeed, and in a cleft stick, for who would ever absolve me? Who would consent that I should go unhung if by the faintest tremor of an overture I were the first to introduce into our perfect intercourse an element so dire? I feel like she's definitely blowing things out of proportion here. He's a kid and he knows that you know what he knows. I mean, we're just trying to protect him anyway. No, it was useless to attempt to convey to Mrs. Gross, just as it is scarcely less so to attempt to suggest here how, in our short, stiff brush in the dark, he fairly shook me with admiration. I was, of course, thoroughly kind and merciful. Never had I placed on his little shoulders hands of such tenderness as those with which, while I rested against the bed, I held him there well under fire. I had no alternative but, in form at least, to put it to him. You must tell me now, and all the truth. What did you go out for? What were you doing there? I can still see his wonderful smile, the whites of his beautiful eyes, and the uncovering of his little teeth shine to me in the dusk. If I tell you, will you understand? My heart at this leaped into my mouth. Would he tell me? I found no sound on my lips to press it, and I was aware of replying only with a vague, repeated, grimacing nod. He was gentleness itself, and while I wagged my head at him, he stood there more than ever a little fairy prince. It was his brightness indeed that gave me a respite. Would it be so great if he were really going to tell me? Well, at last he said, just exactly in order that you should do this. Do what? Think of me, for a change, bad. I shall never forget the sweetness and gaiety with which he brought out the word, nor how, on top of it, he bent forward and kissed me. Oh no, he might be possessed. It was practically the end of everything. I met his kiss and had to make, while I folded him for a minute in my arms, the most stupendous effort not to cry. He had given exactly the account of himself that permitted least of my going behind it, and it was only with the effect of confirming my acceptance of it that, as I presently glanced about the room, I could say that. Then you didn't undress at all? He fairly glittered in the gloom. Not at all. I sat up and read. And when did you go down? At midnight. When I am bad, I am bad. So bad. Bad. Anyway, sorry, ghost story. I see, it's charming. But how could you be sure I would know it? Oh, I arranged that with Flora. His answers rang out with a readiness. She was to get up and look out. Which is what she did do. It was I who fell into the trap. No, you're falling into the trap now. Don't buy these lies. So she disturbed you, and to see what she was looking at, you also looked. You saw. Well, you, I concurred, caught your death in the night air. He literally bloomed so from this exploit that he could afford radiantly to assent. How otherwise should I have been bad enough? He asked. Then, in another embrace, the incident and our interview closed on the recognition of all my reserves of goodness that, for his joke, he had been able to draw upon. And on that deceptive note, we are ending Part 4, which was chapters 9, 10, and 11 of The Turn of the Screw by Henry James. We will be continuing the story. It is a long tale, and things have finally gotten interesting, and we are kind of almost halfway through it. Yay! So if you are enjoying it, glass is half full. I hope you are enjoying it. Let me know. I am planning on reading more, so I'll see you soon for the next one. But meanwhile, there are plenty of other ghost stories. Some longer ones, like the whole Sleepy Hollow, the Legend of Sleepy Hollow, the one with the Headless Horseman. Fun times, spooky times. Halloween times, and a bunch of other little shorter ones, older classic ones, and they're on a playlist of their own with the other scary ones. Oh, and you can also listen to the origins of Coraline too. That's an awesome one. But enough gabbing about other things. I hope you enjoyed tonight's story. The hauntings continue. But now, off to sleep and dream what you will, or stay a while and enjoy another tale. Whichever you choose, I'll speak to you again. And until then, stay spooky, my friends. Good night.